Before the first word of this tale is spoken, a necessary foundation must be laid. What you are about to receive is not a work of fiction, but a mosaic painstakingly assembled from scattered fragments of truth. This narrative is constructed from international police dossiers, Interpol red notices, court transcripts from Marseille to Yerevan, testimonies buried in legal archives, and the diligent work of journalists who tracked a ghost. It is presented to you with a single, unambiguous purpose to collect, synthesize, and convey a sequence of events that occurred in the shadows of our world. The aim is information, the method is narration, the subject is a man who defied easy categorization. If you are prepared to listen to the chronicle of a lawyer who became a legend in the underworld, a godfather who commanded from a wheelchair, then settle in. Let this voice guide you through the labyrinth, and as we embark, if the path seems intriguing, your subscription becomes a key, unlocking more such journeys into the hidden annals of recent history. The story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet struggle of a people finding their footing. Serop Tashchian was born in 1950 in Lebanon, a child of the Armenian diaspora. His was a generation removed from the cataclysm of 1915. But the echoes of the genocide were the bedrock of his community's identity, a shared trauma that forged unbreakable bonds and a profound distrust of external powers. Beirut, in the mid-20th century, was a Paris of the Middle East, a glittering, chaotic hub where commerce and culture collided. For the Armenian enclave, it was a haven of sorts, but life was about more than survival. It was about prospering against the odds. In this pressurized environment, young Serop displayed traits that set him apart. He was not a brute, not a street fighter. He possessed a calculating mind, a patient intelligence. His family, seeing his potential, invested in the greatest tool they could imagine for his ascent: education. Law was the chosen path. To become a lawyer was to master the system's language, to wield its rules as both shield and sword. It was a profession that commanded respect in the legitimate world and offered invaluable utility in any other. Serop Tashchian enrolled at St. Joseph University, one of Beirut's most prestigious institutions. He immersed himself in the codes and statutes, learning the architecture of justice. But outside the lecture halls, Beirut was changing. The Lebanese Civil War, erupting in 1975, tore the city apart. Militias ruled streets, checkpoints divided neighborhoods, and the state's authority crumbled. In this chaos, the rules of the textbook met the rules of the jungle. For a keen legal mind, this presented a unique curriculum. The war economy flourished, smuggling arms deals, protection rackets. The diasporan communities, including the Armenians, often had to navigate these treacherous waters to protect their own. It was here, in the smoky backrooms of war-torn Beirut, that the young law student likely received his first practical lessons in real-world power dynamics. He saw how law and order were mere concepts, easily suspended. He observed how influence worked, how loyalty was currency, and how networks built on ethnic trust could move goods and information where governments could not. This period was the forge. The law degree he earned was not just a certificate, it was a blueprint, a schematic of the system's weaknesses. He graduated not merely as a lawyer, but as a strategist who understood that power ultimately resides not in the letter of the law, but in the ability to operate in its gaps. He earned the nickname that would follow him for life, a title dripping with ironic respect: Serop the Lawyer. It was a label that spoke of his legitimacy, his intellect, his veneer of civility. But in the context of the emerging chaos, it also became a perfect camouflage, a mask behind which a very different kind of practice could be built. The end of his formal studies did not mark Serop Tashchian's graduation into a tranquil practice of civil law. Instead, he stepped out into a Beirut that was a fractured, feverish landscape of competing powers. The Civil War had normalized a state of perpetual transaction where every interaction, from secure bread to crossing a street, was governed by a complex calculus of affiliation, threat, and bribe. For a man with his credentials and his particular community standing, opportunities present themselves in the gray zones that had expanded like cracks in the city's foundation. His legal knowledge became an immediate asset, not necessarily in courtroom, which often held little sway, but in negotiations, in drawing up contracts for deals that existed outside official scrutiny, in understanding the international frameworks that could be exploited for movement of goods. The Armenian network in Lebanon and across the diaspora was tight-knit, built on generations of mutual reliance. It was a natural ecosystem for a budding entrepreneur with a legal mind. Initial whispers, the kind that form the bedrock of such legends, suggest his early ventures were less about narcotics and more about the logistical challenges of a city under siege, securing commodities, arranging passage, facilitating transactions between parties who could not approach each other openly. This was his apprenticeship in applied pressure and influence. He learned to navigate the perilous lines between the various Christian militias, the Palestinian factions, and the remnants of state authority. His value lay in his calm demeanor, his ability to articulate terms, and the unspoken authority his law degree conferred in a world reverting to barbarism. It was during this time that the foundational elements of his future empire were laid. He cultivated contacts not just in the Armenian community, but also with key players in the Maronite circles, and importantly, with individuals connected to the burgeoning European underworld, particularly in France, which had historical ties to Lebanon and a significant Armenian diaspora of its own. Marseille, with its deep, infamous port culture and its own history of Corsican and later globalized crime, became a point of interest. Tashchian's intelligence pointed him westward. The real money, the scalable enterprise, lay not in the localized chaos of Beirut's black markets, but in a product with universal demand and astronomical profit margins: drugs. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw the global narcotics trade entering a new phase of sophistication. The French connection had been dismantled, but the pipelines for heroin from the Golden Triangle and, increasingly, cocaine from South America were seeking new organizers, new corridors. Tashchian, with his diaspora connections providing natural trust networks across continents, saw the architecture clearly. He began to position himself not as a street-level dealer, but as a logistical maestro, a fixer for transnational movement. His legal brain approached trafficking as a complex supply chain puzzle. The product needed to be sourced, transported across multiple international borders, stored, distributed, and the proceeds laundered back into legitimacy. Each step required specialists, corrupted officials, secure routes, and above all, silence enforced by impeccable reputation. He started small, likely using the chaos of the war as cover for testing routes. A shipment of Lebanese hashish to Europe via Cyprus, a consignment of pharmaceuticals diverted and repurposed. Each successful operation added to his capital, both financial and reputational. Within the closed circles of the Armenian criminal diaspora, the word spread. Serop the Lawyer could get things done. He was reliable, discreet, and smart. He didn't flash wealth. He reinvested it into his network. He paid his dues and his people on time. He understood that violence was a tool, not a pastime to be used surgically and as a last resort. His power grew from his perceived fairness and fearsome competence. By the early 1980s, as Beirut burned, Serop Tashchian was already transitioning from a wartime facilitator to a node in the international criminal network. His base remained Lebanon, but his vision and his connections were becoming global. The stage was being set for his entrance into the major leagues, a move that would necessitate a physical relocation to the heart of his emerging operation, a city that was no stranger to Godfathers, Marseille. The move to Marseille in the early 1980s was not an escape from chaos, but a strategic repositioning into a different kind of crucible. Beirut's war was visceral and immediate. Marseille's was colder. A business war fought in port warehouses, suburban villas, and corporate boardrooms laundering dirty money. France's legendary milieu was in a state of flux. The old Corsican gangs, while still powerful, were facing new competition and increasing pressure from law enforcement. Into this landscape, Serop Tashchian arrived not as a supplicant, but as a partner with unique assets. He brought with him the unwavering trust of the global Armenian network, a resource more valuable than any single shipment. This network was his nation without borders, communities in Lebanon, Syria, Armenia, the United States, Canada, and across Europe, bound by language, history, and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. For Tashchian, every Armenian diaspora community was a potential notice source of safe houses, legitimate front businesses, financial conduits, and loyal soldiers who would speak less readily to police. Marseille, with its own ancient port and its history as a gateway between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, was the perfect nexus. He settled not in the gritty back streets of the Panir district, but in the calmer, more affluent neighborhoods, blending in as a respectable immigrant businessman. His guise was perfect. Lebanese-Armenian lawyer who had fled the war to start anew. He began to weave his web with meticulous patience. His first task was to integrate, not to dominate. He forged alliances with the established Corsican families, offering them a proposition they couldn't refuse: access to new, secure supply routes for heroin coming from the Golden Triangle, facilitated through Middle Eastern connection, and later a stake in the exploding cocaine market from South America. He was the bridge between continents. Tashchian's genius lay in his corporate approach. He didn't seek to be a flamboyant kingpin. He sought to be the indispensable chairman of the board. He organized the transportation like a logistics firm executive. Ships arriving at Marseille's Fosse port would have containers with false bottoms or legitimate cargo hiding narcotics. Trucks would then move the goods to discreet storage units, often owned by shell companies linked to the diaspora. From there, distribution networks would fan out across Europe to Paris, Lyon, Brussels, Amsterdam, and into the heartland of Germany. He pioneered methods of concealment that were ingenious in their simplicity: industrial, machinery, furniture. Even religious iconography was used as cover. Money laundering was his particular forte, the natural domain for his legal mind. He invested heavily in real estate across the south of France, not just in flashy villas, though he had those, but in commercial properties, restaurants, and hotels. These businesses served a dual purpose. They generated clean cash flow to commingle with illicit profits, and they provided meeting places and operational hubs. He used the complex banking systems of Lebanon and Switzerland, and later, the nascent, unregulated financial markets of post-Soviet Armenia to move and hide capital. Violence was delegated and kept at arm's length. When enforcement was needed, a disloyal distributor, a threatening competitor, it was carried out by trusted enforcers from within the Armenian network, often brought in from abroad, who would then disappear. The French police, focusing on the violent, attention-drawing gang wars between local factions, initially saw Serop the Lawyer as a peripheral figure, a shady financier perhaps, but not the architect. He cultivated this image of benign obscurity. He was known to be generous within his community, donating to Armenian churches and cultural centers, which further solidified his status as a protector and a man of respect. This philanthropy was not merely cynical, it was integral to his power base, reinforcing the bonds of loyalty. By the mid to late 1980s, Tashchian had established himself as one of the most significant, yet least visible, narcotics traffickers in Europe. His operation was a paradigm shift, less a traditional gang, more multinational, ethnic-based corporation with a ruthless CEO. He had turned the Armenian diaspora's historical insularity, born of persecution into a formidable competitive advantage in the global underworld. The very traits that had ensured the community's survival-type bonds, silent solidarity, mistrust of state authorities became the pillars of his criminal empire. He was no longer just a facilitator, he was a source, and as his influence grew, so too did the scrutiny, setting the stage for a confrontation with forces that operated on a scale even he couldn't fully control. The late 1980s and early 1990s represented the zenith of Serop Tashchian's power, a period where his corporate model of crime reached its most efficient and expansive form. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a geopolitical earthquake, and for visionary criminals, it was a gold rush. New borders, fragile states, corruptible officials, and desperate populations created a playground for illicit enterprise. Tashchian, with his deep connections to the Armenian diaspora, was uniquely positioned to exploit the chaos in the newly independent Republic of Armenia and the broader Caucasus. This wasn't just a new market for drugs, it was a whole new operational frontier. He saw the country not only as a potential distribution hub for the Russian and Eastern European markets, which were opened up to hard drugs with devastating speed, but also as a perfect financial haven and a source of political influence. He began to channel significant investments into Armenia, mixing legitimate business with criminal money laundering on a grand scale. Construction companies, banks, hotels, and import-export firms sprung up with ties to his network. This economic power bought influence, creating a protective layer of officials and politicians who, in a struggling new nation, saw him as a necessary patron. His reputation in Armenia became dual-natured in official circles. He was a successful diaspora businessman, helping the motherland rebuild. In the shadows, he was the undisputed Godfather, his word law. Back in Marseille, his operation became so streamlined it was almost invisible. The violence associated with the drug trade, the street killings, the gangland shootouts was largely the domain of his subcontractors, the distributors and enforcers further down the chain. Tashchian operated in a realm of spreadsheets, encrypted communications, and high-level meetings. He maintained a small, hyper-loyal inner circle, often family members or childhood friends from Beirut, who handled core logistics. His personal life was guarded but comfortable. He married, had children, and presented an image of a prosperous, conservative family man. He was known to be a doting father, fiercely protective of his family's privacy, create a stark dichotomy between the domestic patriarch and the international trafficker. This period also saw the diversification of his portfolio. While heroin and cocaine remained the profit engines, he expanded into arms trafficking, exploiting the vast stockpiles of Soviet weaponry now floating around Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The Balkan conflicts of the 1990s provided a grim opportunity, and his networks proved adept at moving weapons as easily as they moved narcotics. He also deepened his involvement in large-scale fraud, particularly value-added tax VAT, carousel fraud within the European Union, a complex financial crime that exploited differences in tax regimes between member states, netting hundreds of millions with minimal physical risk. This move further demonstrated his preference for high-profit, low-violence criminal enterprises that played to his intellectual strengths. However, the very scale of his success began to generate immense heat. The French police, specifically the Specialized Drug Unit Office Central pour la répression du trafic illicite des stupéfiants, OCAT, and the Intelligence Service Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, DST, had slowly been piecing together the puzzle. They started to recognize a pattern: major narcotic seizures in Marseille and Antwerp, complex money laundering schemes leading to Armenian banks, and whispered references to a shadowy figure called Aleppo in Armenian, or Serop the Lawyer. International pressure was also mounting. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, tracking the global flow of cocaine and heroin, began to see the Armenian networks as a significant emerging threat. Tashchian's name started appearing on wiretaps, in informant debriefings, and on intelligence bulletins. The net was being woven, but it was a complex one to cast. He was a moving target, rarely handling the product himself. Insulated by layers of subordinates and legitimate fronts, arresting him required not just evidence of a single transaction, but proof of his leadership in a continuing criminal enterprise, a much higher bar. The first major crack came not from a drug seizure, but from technology and a rare operational mistake. The increased use of telephone interception by French authorities began to provide a stream of tantalizing, though often coded, conversation. And then, in 1994, a crucial break, a trusted courier was intercepted, leading to a significant heroin seizure. Under pressure, the courier's network began to fray, and the threads, if followed meticulously, led upwards. The authorities realized they were not dealing with a gang, but with a sophisticated corporation, and its CEO was now in their sights. The golden age of impunity was ending. The hunter and the hunted were now locked in a slow, deliberate dance, with Tashchian as intelligence and resources pitted against the relentless, bureaucratic patience of the state. The pressure from law enforcement initiated a new, more perilous chapter for Serop Tashchian, one defined by constant vigilance and strategic adaptation. The mid-1990s saw the French judicial machinery beginning to turn its formidable gears specifically toward him. Investigations, once fragmented across different squads and jurisdictions, were consolidated. A dedicated team of magistrates, police, and intelligence agents started to build a case, not for a single crime, but for association de malfaiteurs en relation avec une entreprise terroriste, association of criminals in relation to a criminal enterprise, a broad charge designed to dismantle organized crime structures. Wiretaps, authorized by investigating judges, became the primary weapon. For years, teams of translators and analysts worked around the clock, listened to thousands of hours of conversations in Armenian, French, Arabic, and Russian. They were piecing together a vast organizational chart, mapping the flow of instructions from Tashchian, often delivered in allegorical or business-like terms to his lieutenants. He was cautious, but the necessity of communication was his Achilles heel. He used payphones, changed mobile phones frequently, and employed coded language, referring to drug shipments as merchandise or clothes, money as books, and law enforcement as the weather. But the sheer volume of traffic over time allowed the patterns to be deciphered. The police also employed sophisticated surveillance, both physical and electronic. They tracked his movements, his meetings in cafes in Marseille's upscale prefecture district or in the Armenian restaurants of Paris. They noted his associates, the cars they drove, the properties they visited. It was a colossal game of chess, with Tashchian constantly trying to anticipate the next move of an opponent with near infinite resources. His response was to further decentralize his operation. He began to spend less time in France, using his Armenian passport to travel frequently to Yerevan, where he felt more secure under his protective umbrella of influence. He also shuttled between other hubs in his network, Lebanon, Syria, Bulgaria, and the United Arab Emirates. From these locations, he attempted to manage his European empire remotely. This global mobility became both a shield and a potential vulnerability. It made him harder to pin down, but his international travels also drew the attention of more agencies, including Interpol, which began to circulate alerts. During this period, Tashchian also faced threats from within the underworld itself. His success and low-profile approach bred resentment among more violent, traditional gangs who saw his corporate methods as an affront. There were whispers of attempts on his life, of conflicts over territory in the European distribution network. The Armenian criminal world was not monolithic. Rival factions saw an opportunity to capitalize on his legal troubles. To navigate these dual threats, the state and the street, Tashchian relied even more heavily on his core tenets: loyalty, intelligence, and extreme discretion. He is said to have settled disputes within his organization with the cold, final logic of a judge, his legal training perversely informing his rulings on underworld conduct. Betrayal or gross incompetence was met with definitive, though carefully orchestrated punishment. These acts were almost always carried out far from France, often in the post-Soviet sphere, where forensic and investigative capabilities were weaker. The most significant internal threat, however, would eventually come from the very tool the state was exploiting: technology. As the investigators' net tightened, they began to successfully flip lower-level members of the organization. Faced with lengthy prison sentences, some couriers, money movers, and even a mid-level lieutenant or two began to cooperate. They provided the human context to the wiretaps, explaining the codes, identifying voices, and detailing the chain of command. This combination of electronic intelligence and human testimony was devastating. By the late 1990s, the investigating magistrates felt they had enough to strike. The goal was a coordinated, multi-country operation that would deliver a crippling blow to the network and, if fortune favored them, capture Tashchian himself. The planning for this strike took years, as mutual legal assistance requests wound their way through bureaucracies from France to Armenia to Switzerland. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, but Tashchian, with his deep well of resources and his paranoid caution, was not an easy quarry. He had spent a lifetime building redundancies and escape routes. The coming assault would test the resilience of his entire empire and force him into a state of permanent flight, marking the beginning of his visible downfall. The dawn of the new millennium did not bring a fresh start for Serop Tashchian. Instead, it ushered in the era of the takedown. The meticulously compiled French dossier, a mountain of wiretap transcripts, financial records, surveillance logs, and witness statements, was finally ready for action. The operation, spanning multiple countries, was launched in the year 2000. It was a seismic event in European law enforcement circles, designed to decapitate the Armenian network in Marseille and scatter its European limbs. In coordinated dawn raids across France, Belgium, and Switzerland, hundreds of police officers simultaneously stormed apartments, villas, business offices, and warehouses. The haul was substantial: millions of euros in cash, seized from safe houses and safety deposit boxes, kilograms of heroin and cocaine, a small arsenal of weapons, and, most importantly, a trove of new documents and digital records. Dozens of Tashchian's associates, from street-level couriers to trusted lieutenants who managed his real estate portfolio, were arrested and thrown into preventative detention. The French media, which had only vaguely alluded to an Armenian connection in the drug trade, now had a name and a face to splash across headlines: Serop Tashchian, le parrain présumé. The network was severely disrupted, its daily operations grinding to a halt as members scrambled, communicated in panic over tapped lines, or simply disappeared. However, the primary prize eluded them. Serop Tashchian was not in France during the raids, warned, perhaps, by the sudden silence from his compromised communication channels or by well-placed contacts within the Armenian or Lebanese communities. He had already slipped the net. He was now a fugitive in the truest sense, his name etched on Interpol red notices, effectively an international wanted man. This marked a fundamental shift in his existence. The calm, boardroom-style management was over. He was now a man on the run, forced to rely entirely on the deepest layers of his network and the sanctity of his diaspora connection. His world shrank to a series of safe houses, his movement restricted to shadows and trusted corridors. He reportedly found initial refuge in Armenia, where his influence and the country's complex political landscape offered some protection from immediate extradition. But even there, The pressure was mounting. International diplomatic whispers, particularly from France and the United States, urged Yerevan to cooperate. Armenia, seeking greater integration with European structures and wary of being branded a narco-state, could not offer him a permanent, open sanctuary. He became a ghost within his own homeland, moving between discrete locations, his power now exercised through whispers and intermediaries rather than direct command. From this fragmented exile, he attempted to rebuild and maintain control. It was an exercise in frustration, with many of his key lieutenants in European jails and others turning state as evidence to reduce their sentences. His operational capacity was crippled. New, younger, and hungrier groups began to encroach on his European territories. Seeing the vacuum left by the raids, the very corporate structure he had built, which had been his strength, now proved fragile without its central processing unit. Loyalty, while still strong in the core, was being tested by the relentless pressure of law enforcement and the allure of seizing a piece of the crumbling empire. Tashchian's response was to double down on what he knew best: finance and influence. From his hidden locations, he focused on safeguarding his vast fortune, moving money through ever more complex layers of shell companies, often using the emerging technologies of online banking and cryptocurrencies in their earliest forms. He also leveraged his remaining political connections in Armenia and Lebanon, not for direct protection from extradition, but to slow the process, to create legal and bureaucratic obstacles that would buy him time. The manhunt for him became a slow-burning international saga. French investigators and magistrates traveled to Yerevan, presenting evidence, filing formal extradition requests that wound their way through the Armenian courts. It was a diplomatic and legal tug-of-war. Tashchian's lawyers, true to his legacy, fought tirelessly, arguing procedural errors, questioning the evidence, and claiming the charges were politically motivated. For years, this legal stalemate continued. Tashchian lived in a state of suspended animation, a king without a kingdom, a CEO whose corporation was under receivership by his enemies. The physical and psychological toll of this life on the run, for a man now in his late 50s, accustomed to control and stability, must have been immense. The once imperious Godfather was now reduced to a bargaining chip in international relations, his fate hinging on court rulings and diplomatic communiques. The relentless pursuit had achieved its first major goal. It had dethroned him, but it had not yet caught him. The next phase would involve a catastrophic event that would change the calculus entirely, not for Tashchian, but for the nation that had been his partial shield. The stalemate of Tashchian's fugitive existence in Armenia stretched through the early 2000s, a tense and wearying game of legal and diplomatic chess. He was a specter haunting the corridors of power in Yerevan, his presence felt but rarely seen. His influence, though diminished from its zenith, still pulsed through certain economic sectors and within the shadowy interstices of the state. The French extradition request languished, entangled in appeals, technicalities, and the unspoken resistance of those who benefited from his patronage or feared his reach. For the French authorities, this was a period of profound frustration. They had the evidence, they had the convictions of his subordinates back in Marseille, but the kingpin remained just out of grasp, a symbol of the limits of international justice. This impasse, however, was shattered not by a police operation, but by an act of shocking political violence that redrew the landscape entirely. On October 22, 1999, a group of gunmen stormed the Armenian parliament, killing the prime minister, the speaker, and 6 other officials. The aftermath of this trauma sent seismic shocks through the young republic, leading to a prolonged period of political instability, recrimination, and a desperate need for the government to consolidate its legitimacy and secure international support. In this new, volatile climate, harboring a globally wanted crime lord became an untenable liability. The Armenian state, seeking to burnish its credentials as a reliable partner in the fight against transnational crime and to secure favor with Western nations, began to reassess its passive protection of Serop Tashchian. The informal shields that had sheltered him started to dissolve. Political allies grew distant. Bureaucrats became less accommodating, and the once porous borders of his gilded cage began to solidify. He could feel the walls closing in. It became clear that Armenia would not be his permanent sanctuary, facing the increasing likelihood of arrest and extradition to France, where a life sentence awaited him. Tashchian made a critical calculation. He had to flee again, to find a new bolt hole beyond the reach of European arrest warrants. His gaze turned south to the Middle East, to a nation with a long history of complex relations with the West and a reputation for providing sanctuary to figures like him. Syria, under the regime of Hafiz al-Assad and later his son Bashar. Syria was a master of leveraging unconventional assets. It was a state that had, for decades, operated as a crossroads for intelligence agencies, militant groups, and, inevitably, criminal networks, often using them as instruments of state policy or as sources of off-the-books revenue. For Tashchian, Syria offered several advantages. It had a significant and well-integrated Armenian community, particularly in Aleppo, where he could blend in culturally and linguistically. It had a government with no extradition treaty with France, and a deep-seated antagonism toward Western judicial encroachments. Furthermore, his old connections from the Lebanese Civil War days, relationships with influential Syrian security officials and business magnates with ties to the regime could potentially be reactivated. Sometime in the mid-2000s, as the Armenian courts began to lean towards acquiescing to French demands, Tashchian vanished from Yerevan. The escape was a testament to his remaining resources. It likely involved a clandestine overland journey, perhaps through Iran or via a circuitous route, relying on loyal drivers and pre-arranged safe houses, eventually bringing him to Syria. He settled in Aleppo, the ancient merchant city, finding refuge within the Armenian quarter. Here, he attempted to recreate a semblance of his old life, albeit on a much smaller and more defensive scale. He invested in local businesses, maintained a low profile, and relied on the protection of the Syrian security apparatus, which likely viewed him as a potentially useful asset and a source of informal revenue. For a few years, it seemed he had found a durable solution. He was beyond the practical reach of French police, living in a country that defied international pressure as a matter of principle. But this new sanctuary was built on the most precarious of foundations. Tashchian had traded the slow-burning legal pressure of Armenia for the volatile, explosive politics of the Levant. He was now ensconced in a nation that was itself hurtling toward an abyss. The Arab Spring, which began in 2010, would soon ripple into Syria, erupting into a full-scale civil war in 2011. The stable, if repressive, regime that offered him protection was suddenly fighting for its survival. Aleppo, his city of refuge, would become the epicenter of some of the conflict's most brutal urban warfare. The carefully reconstructed life of the aging Godfather was about to be consumed by a cataclysm far greater than any police investigation. His wealth, his connections, his cunning, none of it would be a match for the indiscriminate chaos of war. The downfall that had begun with wiretaps in Marseille was now accelerating toward a conclusion shaped by artillery shells and street fighting, moving him from the status of a pursued criminal to a trapped and vulnerable old man in a city under siege. The outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011 transformed Serop Tashchian's world from one of calculated risk into a theater of raw, uncontrollable chaos. Aleppo, once a bustling metropolis and a center of Armenian diaspora life for centuries, became a divided city, a hellscape of sniper alleys, crumbling buildings, and desperate survival. The regime forces, rebel factions, jihadist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, and later Kurdish militias all carved out zones of control, turning neighborhoods into fortresses and streets into killing fields. For Tashchian, this was an existential crisis of a completely different order. The sophisticated apparatus of the Syrian state that had offered him tacit protection shattered into competing power centers, the military intelligence branches, the Shabiha militias, all fighting for the regime's survival, but also pursuing their own agendas. His carefully cultivated contacts within the old security apparatus were now either dead, displaced, or too preoccupied with the war effort to guarantee the safety of an elderly Armenian crime boss. His wealth, while still substantial, became a liability in a city where armed groups of all stripe were funding their war efforts through predation, kidnapping for ransom and confiscation. The Armenian quarter of Aleppo, while somewhat insulated due to its communal cohesion and generally neutral stance, was not immune to the violence. Shells and mortars do not discriminate based on ethnicity or criminal resume. Tashchian found himself trapped, not by the gendarmes of France, but by the front lines of a savage conflict. His mobility, already limited by his fugitive status, and his age, he was now in his early 60s, vanished entirely. Moving across the city meant navigating checkpoints manned by nervous, trigger-happy teenagers from myriad factions, any one of whom might recognize him, kidnap him for his presumed wealth, or simply kill him for being in the wrong place. His corporate empire was a distant memory. Now his concerns were elemental, securing food, water, medicine, and a safe roof over his head. He reportedly moved between a few trusted locations within the relative safety of the Armenian community, relying on the enduring loyalty of a small circle and the protective instinct of the community itself, which historically closed ranks around its own in times of peril. Yet, even this communal shield was porous. The war attracted all manner of opportunists, and the legend of Serop the Lawyer, the wealthy international Godfather hiding in Aleppo, inevitably began to circulate in the shadow economy of the conflict. He became a potential target for kidnapping by criminal gangs operating under the chaos of war, or even by extremist groups aware of his non-Muslim background and presumed riches. His existence became a bleak paradox. He had evaded the most advanced judicial systems in Europe only to be cornered by a form of anarchy that no amount of legal cunning or structured corruption could navigate. During these years, from roughly 2012 onwards, he effectively disappeared from the radar of international law enforcement, not because he had become more clever, but because he was submerged in the overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe of Syria. French investigators monitoring the situation likely believed he was either dead or permanently beyond reach in the maelstrom. His health, never robust, began to falter under the strain of constant stress, poor living conditions, and the lack of consistent medical care. The man who had orchestrated the movement of tons of narcotics across continents now had to worry about finding insulin or heart medication in a bombed-out city. The psychological toll must have been unimaginable. A lifetime of building an empire of control, ending in a reality where he controlled nothing, not even the safety of the next moment. He was a spectator to the utter destruction of the world he had chosen as his final refuge. The elegant calculations of risk and reward were replaced by the random arithmetic of ballistic trajectories. His vast fortune, hidden in offshore accounts and properties across the globe, was useless here. He could not wire transfer his way out of the artillery barrage. In this grim and isolated context, cut off from his family, his network in ruins, his body failing, and his spirit undoubtedly broken by the relentless violence, Serop Tashchian awaited his fate. The end, when it came, would not be in a dramatic courtroom in Marseille, nor in a hail of bullets from a rival gang. It would be a quiet, desperate finale, fitting for a man whose power had ultimately evaporated, leaving behind only a frail human being caught in history's grinding gears. The final act was approaching, not with a bang from the underworld, but with the whimper of a body, and a mind that could no longer endure the relentless pressure of a life lived in perpetual shadow and culminating in outright war. The details of Serop Tashchian's final months are shrouded in the fog of war, pieced together from scant whispers that managed to escape the siege of Aleppo. By 2012, the city was severed in two, with the regime holding the western districts and the rebels entrenched in the east. The Armenian quarter, historically situated in the Midan and Suleimania neighborhoods, found itself perilously close to the shifting front lines. Life for Tashchian became a subterranean existence, both literally and figuratively. It is believed he spent prolonged periods in the relative safety of basements, moving only when absolutely necessary, his world reduced to a few rooms, the sound of distant shelling a constant soundtrack. His health issues, reportedly including diabetes and cardiovascular problems, were exacerbated by the scarcity of proper medication, the stress of perpetual danger, and the degradation of basic amenities. The once fastidious lawyer and businessman, who had conducted meetings in five-star hotels, now contended with power outages, water shortages, and the omnipresent fear of a rocket hitting his building, his connection to the outside world frayed to a thin thread. Communication with any remaining family or associates abroad would have been sporadic, reliant on unreliable satellite phones or daring couriers who could navigate the checkpoints. The flow of money, the lifeblood of his former power, was reduced to a trickle. Accessing his international accounts from within a war zone was nearly impossible, and moving physical cash was incredibly risky. He likely depended on the dwindling resources of the local Armenian community, whatever reserves he had managed to physically store in Aleppo years before. During this time, a poignant and bitter irony defined his existence. The very traits that had fueled his rise, ethnic solidarity, communal trust, insularity, were now his only lifeline. The Armenian community in Aleppo, fighting for its own survival, did not abandon him. They provided shelter, shared meager supplies, and maintained the code of silence. To them, he was not the Armenian godfather of European police files. He was Serop, an elderly, sick man from their community, a fellow survivor of the genocide's long shadow, now facing annihilation once more. This protection, however, had its limits. As the siege tightened and conditions grew more desperate, the internal dynamics of the community were strained. Resources were finite. Could they continue to protect a man who brought no tangible benefit and, in fact, posed a potential danger if his identity were discovered by one of the warring faction? There were rumors, impossible to verify, of approaches made, of feelers put out regarding his possible evacuation from Aleppo, either to regime-held Latakia or even to Armenia, but any such plan would have been a logistical nightmare. He was too weak to travel overland through dangerous territory, and the Syrian government had no reason to expend precious resources evacuating a wanted criminal. The alternative, seeking help from international organizations, was unthinkable. It would have meant immediate identification and arrest. So he remained a prisoner of the conflict. His mind, once famed for its strategic brilliance, must have been a torment of memory and regret replaying the decisions that led him from the courtrooms of Beirut to the besieged ruins of Aleppo. The empires he had built in the shadows of the legitimate world were worthless against the overt, brutal struggle for survival playing out in the streets above his hiding place. The sophisticated corporate structure was gone, replaced by the primal hierarchy of a community under siege. The respect he commanded was no longer born of fear or financial power, but of a residual humanitarian obligation. It was in this context of utter physical depletion and psychological isolation that his body began its final surrender. In early 2013, as the battle for Aleppo raged with unrelenting ferocity, Tashchian's health deteriorated critically. Without consistent, professional medical care, his conditions became unmanageable. A simple infection could become fatal. A diabetic crisis could not be properly treated. The specifics of his final illness are unknown: a stroke, a heart attack, complication. From his diabetes, all are plausible given the circumstances. He died on March 2nd, 2013. There was no dramatic deathbed scene, no last-minute confession or revelation. His passing was a quiet, desperate event, occurring in a darkened room in a shattered city, attended by a handful of faithful companions from the community who had shielded him till the end. The news of his death did not break instantly. In the chaos of Aleppo, deaths were commonplace, and communication with the outside world was fragmented. It took weeks, perhaps months, for the confirmation to seep out through diaspora channels, eventually reaching the ears of law enforcement in Europe. His body was reportedly buried quickly and discreetly in Aleppo, in accordance with Armenian Orthodox rites, in a cemetery that itself would likely suffer damage in the continuing fighting. The location of his grave is uncertain, a final anonymity for a man who spent his life cultivating obscurity. Thus ended the saga of Serop Tashchian. His death was not an ending crafted by justice, but one imposed by circumstance. The French judiciary was denied its symbolic victory of a trial. His rivals were denied the satisfaction of his downfall. He simply ceased to be, swallowed by a conflict whose scale dwarfed his own criminal ambition. His story concluded not with the slam of a prison door, but with the quiet, desperate sigh of a man whose once global reach had shrunk to the four walls of a hiding place, whose final adversary was not the state, but mortality itself. Arriving in a city that had forgotten everything but survival, the confirmation of Serop Tashchian's death in war-torn Aleppo sent complex ripples through the disparate worlds he had inhabited. For the French judiciary and law enforcement agencies that had pursued him for over 2 decades, the news brought a profound sense of anticlimax and unfinished business. A major investigation, one of the most extensive into European drug trafficking at the time, had reached a dead end, not in a courtroom with a verdict, but in the ruins of a foreign city. The magistrates who had built the case, the detectives who had listened to thousands of hours of his coded conversations, were denied the closure of seeing him held accountable before the law. The massive trial of his network, which had resulted in numerous convictions, would forever lack its central figure. There was a formal legal frustration, without a body definitively identified by French authorities and without a conclusive death certificate recognized by international bodies. A sliver of bureaucratic uncertainty remained for some time. Yet the consensus was clear. The hunt was over. Interpol red notices were eventually withdrawn, and active investigations into his direct activities were closed. For them, Tashchian's story became a case study in the limits of extraterritorial reach and the ways in which global chaos can provide a final, impenetrable sanctuary. Within the global Armenian diaspora, the reaction was nuanced and private. In the communities of Marseille, Los Angeles, Beirut, and Yerevan, the news was met with a silent, knowing acknowledgement rather than public mourning. For many ordinary diaspora Armenians, he was a controversial, even embarrassing figure, a symbol of criminality that risked tarnishing the community's hard-earned reputation for resilience and integration. They had no desire to claim him, yet within the closed circles of the diaspora's underworld and among those who had known him personally, his death marked the end of an era. He was the last of a certain breed of Godfather, the intellectual, the strategist, the patron who garnered through respect as much as fear. His rise from the ashes of the genocide and the Lebanese civil war to the pinnacle of European crime was, in a twisted sense, a dark legend of survival and ascendancy. His death in Aleppo, a city sacred to Armenian history, added a tragic, almost mythic layer of circularity. A life born from diaspora trauma ending in a diaspora community under siege, among the criminal factions that had once been part of his empire or had risen to fill the vacuum after his downfall. His passing solidified a new order. The corporate, ethnic-based model he perfected did not die with him, but it fragmented. The network splintered into competing groups, often younger, more violent, and less disciplined. Engaging in bloody turf wars across Europe, some of his logistical innovations and money laundering techniques became standard practice, but the centralized, quasi-legal authority he represented was gone. In Armenia itself, the news was met with official silence and private relief. The government no longer had to navigate the diplomatic tightrope of his extradition. The shadow he cast over segments of the economy and politics began slowly to recede. His death allowed a troubled page to be turned. Even as the structures of corruption he had exploited remained partially in place. For his immediate family, his wife and children, who had lived separate, guarded lives likely in Lebanon or perhaps elsewhere, his death was a private tragedy layered with public notoriety. They had been shielded from the heart of his operations, living with the constant fear of his arrest or assassination. His demise in such distant, violent circumstances likely brought a painful, complicated grief. Severed from the chance for any final reconciliation or understanding, they were left with an inheritance potentially mired in legal complications, as authorities in various countries could seek to seize assets proven to be the proceeds of crime. Finally, for the chroniclers of crime, journalists, authors, and filmmakers, Tashchian's story took on the quality of a modern epic. A Shakespearean tragedy set against the backdrop of late 20th century geopolitics. His journey from law student to fugitive embodied the interplay between opportunity and catastrophe that defined the era, the diasporic search for identity, the corrosive economies of civil war, the criminal bonanza of the post-Soviet collapse, and the ultimate, humbling power of wider historical forces. He was a man who mastered the shadows of the globalized world but was ultimately crushed by the overt, medieval brutality of a regional war. His legacy is not one of glamour, but of a chilling demonstration of how intellect, community, and circumstance can converge to build a vast, invisible empire, and how that same empire can evaporate when faced with the uncontrollable tide of history. The story of Serop the Lawyer serves as a stark parable about the nature of power, its illusion, its limitations, and its inevitable decay. To fully comprehend the architecture of Serop Tashchian's power, one must look beyond the man and examine the intricate, self-sustaining ecosystem he helped pioneer, the ethnic criminal corporation. This model, while not invented by him, was refined to an unprecedented degree under his stewardship. It was a system perfectly adapted to the late 20th century's realities of globalization, diaspora, and weak states. At its core was the Armenian network itself, a global community still bearing the scars of 1915, for whom trust was reserved almost exclusively for those who shared that history. This provided a ready-made infrastructure of loyalty. Recruitment was not from the street, it was from the family, the village of origin, the church community. A cousin in Lyon could be trusted to receive a shipment. A childhood friend from Beirut could manage a front company in Yerevan. A fellow parishioner in Montreal could vouch for a money mover. This inherent trust drastically reduced the risks of betrayal that plagued traditional, multi-ethnic gangs. Communication was safer in their native tongue, using cultural reference and idioms that were impenetrable to outsiders. Even with a wiretap, the diaspora's geographical spread was its second strategic advantage. It provided natural endpoints and waypoints for transnational logistics. A shipment of cocaine from Colombia could be received by an Armenian connected broker in Venezuela's ship via a corrupt port official in West Africa, where diaspora traders existed, arrive at the port of Antwerp, facilitated by an Armenian import-export firm, be stored in a warehouse owned by a Luxembourg holding company with Armenian directors, and distributed by crews in Paris answering to a boss in Marseille. At each node, the connection was reinforced by ethnic and familial bonds, creating a chain far more resilient than one based on mere financial transaction. Tashchian's genius was to recognize this latent network not as a collection of individual contacts, but as a single, distributed organism. He became its central nervous system. His role was that of a coordinator and arbitrator. He ensured that the cocaine supplier in South America was paid reliably by the heroin distributor in Europe, using the system's own internal clearing mechanisms, sometimes involving trade-based money laundering or the exchange of other illicit goods like arms or diamonds. He settled disputes between different factions within the network, his word carrying the weight of law because he was seen as fair and because his judgment was backed by the collective will of the organization. He reinvested profits into the network itself, buying legitimate businesses that could employ members, fund community centers, and generate clean cash flow. This created a virtuous cycle for the organization. Crime funded legitimacy, which protected and facilitated further crime, while also earning goodwill and deepening loyalty within the wider diaspora. This model was incredibly difficult for law enforcement to penetrate. It was not a pyramid with a clear hierarchy that could be toppled by arresting the top. It was more like a mycelial network of vast, underground web, where cutting one strand did little to harm the whole. Investigators would follow a drug trail from Marseille to an Armenian in Sofia, only to find that he was merely a custodian, holding product for a principal in Dubai who was acting on instructions from a lawyer in Geneva who represented a trust that ultimately benefited a foundation in Yerevan. The money followed an even more convoluted path, flowing through offshore havens, real estate investments in multiple countries, and complex trade invoicing scams. Violence was externalized and ritualized when enforcement was required, say, against a Greek trafficker trying to muscle in on a distribution route in Germany. It was often carried out by a separate, specialized cell, perhaps composed of former soldiers from the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict who would enter the country, execute the task with clinical precision, and exit immediately, leaving no local connections for police to follow. Tashchian himself was insulated by layers of operational security and legitimate facade. He held meetings in the offices of his lawyers or in upscale restaurants. He drove modest cars. He was a generous donor to Armenian causes, to the outside world, and even to much of the Armenian community. He was a successful, low-profile businessman. This corporate, almost nation-like structure was his true legacy. It demonstrated how criminal enterprise could mimic and exploit the very frameworks of globalization and diaspora identity. It showed that in a world of nation-states, a stateless nation could, in the shadows, build its own sovereign, illicit economy, with its own laws, its own treasury, and its own Godfather as a de facto head of state. This was the empire Serop Tashchian ruled, not from a throne, but from a desk, his authority deriving not from fear alone, but from his perceived role as the chief executive of a dark reflection of his people's scattered destiny. The operational engine of Tashchian's empire, the day-to-day mechanics that transformed his strategic vision into tangible profit, was a masterpiece of illicit logistics and financial alchemy. It functioned with the cold precision of a multinational supply chain division, albeit one whose cargo was contraband and whose bottom line was measured in pure, laundered cash. The procurement phase was the first critical link for heroin. Connections in the Golden Triangle, primarily Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, were essential. Here, Tashchian's network leveraged older Lebanese-Armenian connections, middlemen who had been involved in the hashish trade and had established relationships with Southeast Asian producers. The heroin would be processed in hidden labs, then transported, often overland through China or via cargo ships from Thai ports like Laem Chabang, hidden among legitimate goods and containers. For cocaine, the sourcing shifted to South America. Colombian cartels, particularly in the turbulent 1980s and 90s, seeking reliable European partners to diversify from the saturated U.S. market. The Armenian network, with its European distribution prowess, became an attractive outlet. Initial contacts were likely made through intermediaries in Panama or Venezuela, countries with their own Armenian commercial communities. The cocaine would be shipped via go-fast boats to mother ships, or hidden in commercial container cargo frozen fish, timber, fruit departing from ports like Buenaventura or Guayaquil. The maritime journey was the most vulnerable phase. Tashchian's organization invested heavily in port corruption. They identified and bribed customs officials, port authority workers, and shipping company clerks in key transit hubs, the Djibouti for Red Sea routes, Durban or Cape Town in South Africa for Atlantic crossing, and of course the final destination ports of Marseille, Fos, Antwerp, and Rotterdam. A single compromised official could ensure a container was waved through without inspection, or moved to a secure area for offloading. Once in Europe, the storage and distribution network took over. The drugs were moved to secure cut houses or warehouses, often in industrial zones on the outskirts of major cities, owned by front company. Here, the product was cut with adulterants to maximize volume, tested for purity, and packaged for wholesale distribution. Tashchian rarely, if ever, touched the physical product at this stage. His subordinates, organized into discrete cells, handled regional distribution. The French market was managed from Marseille and Paris. The Benelux and German markets were serviced from Antwerp and Brussels. Separate cells handled the UK, Italy, and Spain. Each cell was semi-autonomous, responsible for its own security and local sales. But they all reported up through a chain of command that ultimately led back to Tashchian and his inner circle. They paid a tax, a percentage of profits up the chain in return for the supply, logistical support, and protection. The financial arm of the operation was arguably Tashchian's most brilliant and enduring innovation. Moving billions in drug proceeds back into the legitimate economy without raising alarms was a monumental task. He employed a multi-layered system. The first layer was classic trade-based money laundering. His network owned or controlled import-export companies. They would over-invoice for imports, say, purchasing textiles from Armenia for 10 times their actual value and pay with drug cash, thus injecting dirty money into a legitimate business and generating a paper trail for the inflated revenue. Or they would under-invoice exports, selling French wine to a shell company in Russia at a fraction of its value, with the difference paid secretly into offshore accounts. The second layer involved the real estate markets of southern France, Spain, and Armenia. Cash from street sales, collected in various European cities, would be physically transported via cash couriers, often unsuspecting students or elderly relatives used as mules, to these regions. There, it would be used to purchase properties outright or make large down payments. The properties would then be sold, often to other shell companies within the network, creating a series of transactions that gradually whitened the cash. The third and most sophisticated layer utilized the global banking system and offshore havens. Money would be wired through a dizzying series of shell companies registered in tax havens like Panama, the British Virgin Islands, and Liechtenstein. These companies, with nominee directors and shareholders, owned other companies that held the real assets. Tashchian's legal training was invaluable here. He understood corporate structure and international finance laws well enough to exploit their weaknesses. He also reportedly made early use of Hawala-type informal value transfer systems within the diaspora, where money could be deposited with a trusted broker in Marseille and collected by an associate in Yerevan without any physical movement of cash or formal bank records. This entire financial ecosystem was monitored and managed by a small team of accountants and lawyers, some witting, some unwitting, who created the necessary documentation to withstand superficial scrutiny. The system's strength was its modularity and deniability. If one distribution cell was busted, it could be amputated without endangering the whole body. If one money laundering route was discovered, It could be abandoned for another. Tashchian, at the center, was the only one who saw the complete picture, the only indispensable component. This operational blueprint, this cold fusion of diaspora trust and corporate logistics, was what made him not just a powerful trafficker, but a revolutionary figure in the annals of organized crime, proving that the most successful criminal enterprises are those that most closely mirror the efficient, impersonal structures of legitimate global business. The relentless pursuit by French authorities, while initially foiled by Tashchian's mobility and foreign sanctuary, was a sustained campaign of attrition that ultimately crippled his empire from the outside while internal pressures mounted. The investigation, spearheaded by tenacious examining magistrates like those based in Marseille, operated on multiple parallel tracks that slowly constricted his operational space. Financial investigation units, such as France's Trafficking, began to follow the money with increasing sophistication. They employed techniques like pattern analysis on international wire transfers, looking for circular payments, transactions to known offshore jurisdictions, and purchases of high-value assets by companies with no visible legitimate income. This financial scrutiny made the laundering process, once a smooth conduit, increasingly fraught with risk. Each new layer of obfuscation added cost and complexity, and each transaction left a digital footprint that could be analyzed. The pressure on the money was as effective as pressure on the drugs, without a way to safely enjoy and reinvest profits. The criminal enterprise lost its ultimate purpose. Simultaneously, international judicial cooperation, though slow, gradually improved. The French magistrates used mutual legal assistance treaties, MLATs, to formally request information and evidence from a growing list of countries: Switzerland for bank records, Lebanon for background check, Bulgaria for surveillance on associates, and crucially, Armenia. Each successful request, each piece of evidence handed over, even if delayed, added another brick to the prosecutorial wall. These requests also had a diplomatic chilling effect. They signaled to host countries that harboring Tashchian's interests came with a cost to their international standing. The investigative strategy was patient and holistic. They didn't just target Tashchian. They targeted his entire environment. They arrested and flipped his lieutenants like the trusted couriers who knew the routes, or the accountants who understood the money flows. They placed listening devices in the cars and offices of his lawyers and frontmen. They conducted lengthy surveillance on his family members, not necessarily because they were involved, but to understand his patterns of communication and concern. This created an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia within the network. Trust, the very bedrock of the ethnic corporate model, began to erode. Associates wondered if their phones were tapped, if their colleagues were informants, if their next meeting was being watched. This psychological warfare was perhaps as damaging as any physical seizure. The French police also leveraged the media strategically, controlled leaks about the investigation, about the scale of his empire, and about his international manhunt served to isolate him further. It turned him into a celebrity fugitive, making it harder for him to move discreetly, and putting any official who assisted him under immediate suspicion. The Armenian Godfather narrative, while sensational, acted as a form of pressure, ensuring he could never fully relax into a quiet retirement. Furthermore, the geopolitical landscape began to shift against him. After the 9/11 attacks, global focus on terrorism financing led to tighter regulation on informal banking and increased scrutiny on all illicit financial networks, including his. The war on terror's tools became, indirectly, tools in the war on drug trafficking. International bodies like the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, began pressuring countries, including Armenia and Lebanon, to strengthen their anti-money laundering laws, closing some up. The loopholes Tashchian's network exploited. The final, external blow was the Syrian civil war itself. While it provided a chaotic refuge, It also completely severed his ability to manage his European operation. He could no longer effectively coordinate logistics, settle disputes, or oversee the financial machinery from a basement in Aleppo. The sophisticated, responsive corporation became a headless body, its limbs flailing and vulnerable. The French investigation, though it could not reach him physically in Syria, had already done it. Work by dismantling his command structure in Europe and making the financial environment hostile. His flight to Syria was less an escape and more a desperate retreat into irrelevance. The combined weight of these external forces, financial tracking, international legal cooperation, psychological pressure, geopolitical change, and finally, war proved that no criminal enterprise, no matter how well designed, is truly sovereign. It exists at the sufferance of the legitimate world, and when that world decides to apply its full, patient, bureaucratic might, the shadows can be illuminated, the networks can be mapped, and the Godfather, for all his cunning, can be reduced to a frail man waiting for the end in a city that is itself dying. The French never got their trial, but their investigation successful, exiled, isolated, and functionally dismantled his power long before his body gave out, proving that the long arm of the law, though it may move slowly, can reach across continents and years to achieve a form of justice. Serop Tashchian's life and criminal trajectory cannot be divorced from the unique historical and sociological context of the Armenian diaspora, a community whose collective memory and experience became the unwitting clay from which his empire was molded. The Armenian genocide of 1915 was not merely a historical event for his generation. It was a living trauma, a foundational story passed down through families, shaping a worldview defined by survival against existential threats from powerful states. This history fostered an intense internal solidarity and a deep, often justified, distrust of external authorities. Governments had betrayed them, so the primary unit of trust became the family, the village association, the church parish, the hamaink, or collective. This created a social ecosystem where problems were solved internally, where silence towards outsiders was a virtue, and where communal loyalty was paramount. Tashchian, a product of this environment, instinctively understood and exploited these traits. His network was not a corruption of diaspora values, but a dark perversion of them. He turned the protective insularity, born of persecution, into a shield for criminality. He leveraged the global web of familial and village connections, originally meant for mutual aid and cultural preservation, into a logistical grid for narcotics. The diaspora entrepreneurial spirit, honed by generations of having to rebuild from nothing in foreign lands, was channeled into illicit enterprise. He became, in a twisted sense, a patron of his community, but one who funded its institutions with poisoned money, creating a dangerous dependency. His donations to churches, schools, and cultural centers were not purely cynical, they were an investment in his legitimacy and a reinforcement of the very bonds that protected him. This created a moral dilemma for many in the diaspora. To reject him entirely was to reject one of their own who had succeeded in a hostile world and who gave back. To accept him was to risk the community's hard-won reputation. Most chose a quiet, uneasy coexistence, looking the other way, a dynamic he counted on. Furthermore, his story is inextricably linked to the chaos of post-colonial Lebanon. The Lebanese Civil War was the forge where his theoretical understanding of law met the brutal reality of power vacuums. In a country where sectarian militias became de facto states, the classic Armenian position was one of armed neutrality, defending their enclaves but avoiding full alignment with any major faction. This required a delicate, often clandestine, diplomacy and a thriving underground economy to secure weapons and supplies. Tashchian, the law student, received a practical master's degree in this environment. He saw how commerce continued amidst the bullets, how loyalties were traded, and how the absence of a central state created opportunities for non-state networks to flourish. The war normalized a universe where the rule of law was absent, and survival depended on one's own wits and community. When he moved to Marseille, he was simply transferring the lessons of Beirut's fractured sovereignty to a European context, where the state was present but could be circumvented. The third critical context was the collapse of the Soviet Union. For the Armenian diaspora, this opened the door to the historic homeland, a place of immense emotional significance but also of devastating economic hardship and institutional corruption. Tashchian saw in Armenia not just a motherland to help, but a frontier, a weak state with a desperate need for capital, and a ruling class open to patronage. His investments, a mix of genuine development and money laundering, allowed him to buy, influence, and create a state within a state. He understood that in a country struggling to define itself, economic power could translate directly into political immunity. His ability to navigate these three worlds, the traumatized diaspora, the stateless chaos of civil war Lebanon, and the corruptible frontier of post-Soviet Armenia, is what made him a figure of such formidable reach. He was a chameleon who could present as a respectable diaspora businessman in Marseille, a wartime facilitator in Beirut, and a patriotic investor in Yerevan. Each identity was authentic in its way, yet each served to conceal the core criminal enterprise. His ultimate fate, trapped and dying in the Syrian civil war, is the final, grim piece of contextual poetry. Syria, under the Assads, had long been a manipulator of non-state actors and illicit economies for its own ends. By seeking refuge there, Tashchian was returning to the kind of environment that had birthed him a regime that operated like a mafia, where deals were made in shadows. But the war unleashed forces far beyond the control of any regime or godfather. He was ultimately consumed by the very type of large-scale, chaotic conflict that had initially granted him opportunity, proving that the violence of history, which he had learned to navigate and exploit for decades, could also, in its final iteration, erase him completely. His life, therefore, stands as a dark testament to how individual agency intersects with vast historical currents. He was not a self-made man, he was a diaspora-made man, a war-made man, a post-Soviet-made man. He used the specific tools and traumas of his people's history to build a kingdom in the shadows, only to have that kingdom dismantled by the very modern states he evaded, and then obliterated by the atavistic fury of the region that shaped him not. The human cost of Serop Tashchian's empire was vast, diffuse, and largely unrecorded, a dark river of suffering flowing beneath the sleek surface of his corporate operation. It is a cost measured not in seized kilos or laundered euros, but in shattered lives, ravaged communities, and the corrosive spread of corruption. The most direct and visible victims were the countless individuals across Europe beyond who succumbed to the heroin and cocaine his network pumped into the streets. Marseille, his operational hub, saw entire neighborhoods gripped by addiction, with the social fabric tearing under the strain of drug-related crime, overdose deaths, and blighted futures. Families were destroyed by addiction, children neglected, and a cycle of poverty and despair perpetuated. The human misery generated in the housing project of France's banlieues, in the nightclubs of Brussels, and in the quieter suburbs of Germany was the direct, if distant, product of the logistical decisions made in his meetings. Each wholesale shipment he authorized broke down into thousands of retail doses, each dose a potential catalyst for personal catastrophe. Beyond the end users, there were the casualties within the trade itself, the low-level couriers, often young and vulnerable members of the diaspora or other marginalized groups who faced long prison sentences when caught, used as disposable pawns in his system. They bore the brunt of law enforcement's wrath, while the architects remained insulated. They were also the victims of the violence that was an inherent, if managed, part of his business, while Tashchian preferred arbitration. Enforcement was sometimes necessary. Rival traffickers were killed, informants were silenced, and those who threatened the organization's security were eliminated. These were not abstract hits. They were murders that left family grieving, often in countries far from the cause of the conflict. The 1996 assassination of Jean-Pierre Sort, a French drug trafficker linked to the network, was one such case that brought the violence to French headlines. A rare visible flare from the usually submerged world he controlled. Then there was the corruption, a more insidious form of damage to operate. His network systematically corrupted officials at every level, customs agents in ports from South America to Antwerp, police officers in Marseille and Paris, bankers in Switzerland and Lebanon, and politicians and bureaucrats in Armenia and likely elsewhere. This corruption eroded public trust in institutions, perverted the rule of law, and created a cynicism that extended far beyond the immediate criminal acts. It taught that every official had a price, that the system was rigged, and that legitimacy was for sale. In post-Soviet Armenia, where state building was fragile, the infiltration of his capital and influence warped economic development and political processes, arguably delaying the country's democratic consolidation and reinforcing kleptocratic tendencies. The diaspora communities he sprang from also paid a price. While some benefited from his patronage, the broader community faced increased stigmatization and police scrutiny. Law enforcement agencies, seeing the effectiveness of the ethnic model, sometimes engaged in profiling, viewing successful Armenian businessmen with undue suspicion. The noble narrative of diaspora survival and success was tainted by the notoriety of the Armenian Godfather. This placed a heavy burden on law-abiding members of the community who had to work twice as hard to prove their legitimacy. Finally, there was a profound personal cost within his own inner circle and family. His life on the run, the constant fear of arrest or assassination, the isolation, and the ultimate descent into the hell of Aleppo. These were the wages of his choices. His family lived under a shadow, their lives circumscribed by security concerns and the shame of his infamy. They were denied a normal existence, hostages to his legacy. His own death, alone and desperate in a besieged city, was a terrible human end, devoid of dignity or peace. It was the final, personal installment of the cost he ultimately bore. When we consider the legacy of a figure like Tashchian, it is crucial to look past the myth of the powerful, untouchable Godfather and see the wake of destruction left behind. The sophisticated corporate structure, the ethnic solidarity, the clever money laundering, all of it was in service of an industry whose primary export is human degradation. The empires built on narcotics are pyramids resting on a base of addiction, fear, and corruption. The billions generated represented not just wealth, but a massive transfer of suffering from the coca fields of Colombia and the poppy fields of Myanmar to the streets of Europe, into the very institutions meant to protect society. Tashchian's story, therefore, is not a glamorous tale of outlaw success, but a cautionary chronicle of how intelligence and opportunity, when divorced from ethics and aimed at exploitation, can create a machine of immense harm, a machine that ultimately consumes even its creator. The true measure of his empire is found not in its financial statement, but in the silent, scattered graves of overdoses, in the prison cells filled with small-time couriers, in the corrupted hearts of public servants, and in the besieged basement where an old, sick man, once a king of shadows, realized too late the price of the throne he had built. The mythologizing of Serop Tashchian began even during his lifetime and accelerated after his death, transforming the man into a potent symbol whose meaning shifts depending on the observer. Within the global underworld, he became the archetype of the gentleman, gangster, a figure revered for his intellect over his brutality. His nickname, Serop the Lawyer, encapsulated this ideal, a criminal who outsmarted the system, using its own tools, who commanded through wit and organization rather than sheer terror. In the prison yards of Europe and the back rooms of criminal enterprises from the Caucasus to South America, his story is told as a masterclass in criminal management. He is the patron saint of a certain criminal modernity. The CEO who never gets his hands dirty, who understands that money laundering is more important than the drug deal itself, and who builds an empire on the unshakable foundation of ethnic loyalty for aspiring traffickers. His life is a playbook on leveraging diaspora networks, on the corporate structuring of crime, and on the strategic use of violence as a last resort. His ultimate demise in Aleppo does little to tarnish this legend. In fact, it adds a layer of tragic heroism, a fallen king brought low not by a rival, but by the uncontrollable tide of war. Within the Armenian diaspora, the myth is more complex and fraught. For a minority that has endured genocide and displacement, narrative of survival and success against the odds are central to identity. Tashchian's story uncomfortably fits into this narrative. From a certain angle, he is a dark embodiment of diaspora resilience, a boy from a traumatized community who used his wit to rise to the top of a ruthless international world, who never forgot his roots, and who donated to Armenian causes. This creates a dangerous, seductive counter-narrative that can, in some corners, glamorize his path as a form of empowerment in a world that has historically marginalized Armenians. It is a myth that conflates financial success with worth, and communal loyalty with moral absolution. For others in the diaspora, he is a source of deep shame, a figure whose criminality reinforces negative stereotypes and draws unwanted attention from law enforcement. They work actively to dismantle the myth, emphasizing that true Armenian success is found in academia, arts, business, and law, the legitimate paths. In Armenia itself, the official myth is one of erasure. The state, eager to move past its post-Soviet lawless era and attract clean investment, has little interest in memorializing a figure who represented a period of criminal influence over politics and the economy. He is a ghost in the national closet, acknowledged in whispers but not in textbooks. For Western law enforcement and media, Tashchian became the myth of the invisible Godfather, a symbol of the new, elusive face of transnational organized crime in a globalized age. He was not a flamboyant Pablo Escobar building zoos and inciting war with the state. He was a quiet, calculating operator who revealed the limitations of traditional policing. His case study is used in training academies to illustrate the challenges of combating ethnic-based corporate-style criminal networks that operate across multiple jurisdictions. The myth here is one of daunting complexity, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who best mimic legitimate global citizens. Finally, in the realm of popular culture and true crime, his story is ripe for myth-making. It contains all the elements of an epic tragedy: the rise from humble origins, the mastery of a secret world, the cat-and-mouse game with international police, the tragic end in a war zone. It is a story that speaks to themes of identity, power, loyalty, and fate. The myth here risks sanitizing the reality, focusing on the strategic genius and the dramatic escape, while glossing over the addiction, corruption, and murder that were the actual products of his work. The danger of all these myths, in their various forms, is that they can obscure the essential, grim reality of Tashchian's life and work. They can turn a sophisticated purveyor of human misery into a romantic anti-hero, a boardroom strategist, or a tragic victim of circumstance. The true man was a complex fusion of all these perceptions: intelligent, loyal, ruthless, pragmatic, but the core of his legacy is the vast criminal machine he built and operated. The myths serve our need for narrative, for clear archetypes and more lessons. But the reality of Serop Tashchian resides in the cold, hard facts of wiretap transcripts, seized drug ledgers, and the silent testimony of the communities scarred by the trade he mastered. He He was a man of his time and his tribe, who used the tools available to him to build an empire in the gaps of the world order, an empire that, like all empires built on sand, was eventually washed away by the tides of law, history, and war, leaving behind not a glorious legend, but a cautionary tale written in ruined lives and a forgotten grave in a shattered city. The downfall and death of Serop Tashchian did not herald the end of the criminal model he perfected. Rather, it signaled its evolution and fragmentation. The corporate, diaspora-based structure he pioneered proved to be a robust blueprint, adaptable and resilient even without its original architect. In the years following his disappearance into Aleppo and his confirmed death, the landscape of Armenian organized crime in Europe underwent a significant transformation. The centralized, Marseille-based command structure that answered to the lawyer dissolved. Without his unifying authority and his role as ultimate arbiter, the network splintered into competing factions. These newer groups, often led by younger, more aggressive figures who had come up within Tashchian's system but lacked his strategic patience and preference for low visibility, began to vie for control of the lucrative European drug routes. This led to a period of increased violence in the mid-2010s, particularly in Belgium and Spain, as these factions fought bloody turf wars. The ethnic core remained trust was still rooted in Armenian family and village connection, but the discipline of the corporate model gave way to more traditional gangland rivalries. These groups also expanded their geographical reach, strengthening ties with Latin American cocaine suppliers and establishing deeper footholds in the United Arab Emirates, a key global hub for both logistics and money laundering. They diversified their activities further into cybercrime, large-scale VAT fraud, and cryptocurrency-based money laundering, showing an ability to adapt to new technological frontiers that Tashchian himself had only begun to explore. Furthermore, the geopolitical shifts that followed his death created new opportunities. The continued weakness of the Lebanese state and the economic collapse in Lebanon provided a fertile ground for criminal enterprises to embed themselves deeper into the country's political and financial fabric, with Armenian groups playing a significant role in the shadow economy. In Armenia itself, the 2018 Velvet Revolution, which swept a reformist government to power, promised to crack down on corruption and oligarchic control. This put pressure on the remnants of Tashchian's financial legacy in the country, forcing a further disentanglement of his illicit capital from the legitimate economy, though the process was slow and incomplete. The revolution also aimed to reduce the state's vulnerability to capture by such networks, though the deep-rooted nature of the problem meant it was a generational challenge. Meanwhile, international law enforcement had learned from the Tashchian investigation the painstaking, multi-year process of mapping ethnic networks following the money across borders and using synchronized, multi-jurisdictional takedowns became a standard template for combating similar organizations. Europol established dedicated projects to monitor Eurasian organized crime groups, including Armenian networks. The focus shifted from just arresting kingpins to systematically dismantling their financial infrastructure, seizing properties, freezing bank accounts, and prosecuting the lawyers and accountants who enabled them. The war in Syria, which had claimed Tashchian, also had a paradoxical effect. The chaos created new smuggling routes for drugs and arms, and new alliance between surviving criminal elements and various armed factions. Some figures with links to the old network may have found new roles in this war economy, demonstrating the chameleonic ability of such structures to survive within chaos. The story of post-Tashchian Armenian organized crime is thus one of metastasis rather than eradication. The core formula exploiting tight-knit diaspora ties for trust, leveraging global connection for logistics, and using complex financial engineering to launder profits remained potent. However, the centralizing figure was gone, replaced by a more volatile, competitive, and digitally savvy generation of criminals. His legacy, therefore, is ambiguous. On one hand, he demonstrated the peak efficiency of a certain criminal paradigm. On the other, his life and death also revealed its ultimate vulnerabilities, its dependence on the health of its central node, its susceptibility to relentless financial investigation, and its helplessness before overwhelming historical forces like full-scale war. The networks that survived him learned from both his successes and his failures. They operate with more cellular independence, use more sophisticated encryption, and are quicker to adopt new financial technologies. They are the inheritors of his system, but they rule a more fragmented, and in some ways more dangerous, underworld where the restraining influence of a single, calculated Godfather has been replaced by the unpredictable ambitions of many. The ghost of Serop Tashchian, the lawyer who became a legend, thus continued to haunt the corridors of international crime, not as an active player, but as the founding father of a modern criminal methodology, a dark benchmark against which the next generation measures itself, for better or worse. If we step back from the intricate details of shipments, wiretaps, and safe houses, the life of Serop Tashchian presents a profound and unsettling philosophical inquiry into the nature of power, identity, and the legacy of trauma. His story forces us to ask where the line is between a community's protective adaptation and its criminal perversion, between a survivor's cunning and a predator's exploitation. He was, in many ways, a logical product of a specific historical equation. Take a people subjected to a trauma that shatters their trust in state structures, place them in a diaspora where economic success is both a necessity and a form of revenge against history, then drop them into the lawless crucible of a civil war. From this alchemy, a figure like Tashchian is not an aberration, but a possible, even predictable outcome. He weaponized the diaspora's greatest strength, its cohesive, internal loyalty, turning it into a shield for activities that harmed the very societies that had given his community refuge. This poses a difficult question about collective responsibility and the dark shadows of survival. Can a community that has endured genocide be blamed for producing individuals who, in their ruthless pursuit of security and status, mirror the very lawlessness that victimized them? Tashchian's life suggests that unprocessed historical trauma, when channeled through ambition and opportunity, can manifest in ways that perpetuate cycles of harm rather than break them. His power was also a study in illusion. For years, he projected an image of invincibility, the untouchable Godfather operating from the shadows. Yet, this power was always contingent, always parasitic on the functioning of the legitimate world he sought to evade. It depended on corruptible officials, on gaps in financial regulation, on the stability of nations like Syria that could offer sanctuary. When the French state applied its slow, bureaucratic pressure, that power began to contract. When Syria collapsed into war, that power evaporated entirely, leaving a sick old man hiding in a basement. His empire was a palace built on ice, impressive and complex, but destined to melt when the climate of his circumstances changed. This reveals a fundamental truth about criminal power. It is not sovereign. It is a shadow that exists only in relation to the light of the legitimate order, and when that order flexes its muscles or, conversely, completely disintegrates, the shadow loses its form. Furthermore, his narrative challenges simplistic notions of justice. The formal justice system, represented by the French courts, never got to pass sentence on him. Instead, a form of historical or existential justice seemed to intervene. He died not at the hands of the law, but as a casualty of a war that was, in part, a larger symptom of the region's corrupt and fractured politics, a system he himself had thrived within. His end was ignominious, isolated, and stripped of all the trappings of his former authority. In a poetic sense, he was judged not by a panel of magistrates, but by the very chaos he had mastered for so long and found wanting. This raises the question of whether such an end is more or less just than a life sentence in a French prison. It certainly provided a different kind of closure, one devoid of legal ritual but rich in symbolic finality. Finally, his legacy is a cautionary tale about the seduction of the criminal mastermind narrative. Our culture is often fascinated by figures who operate outside the rules, who build their own systems of order and loyalty. Tashchian's intelligence, his corporate approach, and his ability to evade capture for so long can make him seem like an anti-heroic figure, a rebel against the system. But this is a dangerous romanticization. The system he built was one of profound exploitation. It fed addiction, corrupted institutions, and ultimately left a trail of human wreckage across continents. The brilliance of the logistics does not sanctify the cargo. The sophistication of the money laundering does not cleanse the money. His story, when stripped of myth, is ultimately one of a great intelligence applied to a deeply destructive purpose. It reminds us that the measure of a life is not in the complexity of the game one plays, but in the consequences of that game for other human beings. In the end, Serop Tashchian's life offers no easy morals. He was neither a simple monster nor a romantic rogue. He was a complex human being who made a series of consequential choices within a specific historical and social context. He leveraged the pain of his people to build a personal kingdom, and in doing so he created new forms of pain. He achieved a form of power that ultimately proved illusory and transient. He evaded one form of justice, only to be met by another, more brutal and impersonal one. His story is a dark mirror held up to the 20th century, reflecting the diasporic struggle for identity, the criminal opportunity of globalization, and the ultimate, humbling power of larger historical forces over even the most cunning of individual plans. To understand him is to understand a piece of the shadow history of our modern world, a history written not in treaties and wars, but in silent shipments, coded conversations, and the quiet, desperate sigh of an ending in a city under siege, the final act of the Serop Tashchian saga, the confirmation and aftermath of his death, unfolded with the same ambiguity and distance that characterized his later years. The news did not break as a flash bulletin on international wires, but seeped out slowly through the scarred channels of a war-torn diaspora. In the spring of 2013, whispers began to circulate in the Armenian communities of Beirut, Los Angeles, and Marseille. Serop was gone. He had died in Aleppo. The details were scant, shrouded in the fog of a conflict where death was a daily statistic and verification was a luxury. It took weeks, perhaps months, for the whispers to solidify into a credible report, and longer still for that information to travel through informal networks to the desks of French investigators and international crime reporters. For the French judiciary, the news arrived as a vexing anticlimax. A team of magistrates from Marseille, who had dedicated years of their professional lives to build a case against him, were reportedly informed through diplomatic and intelligence channels. There was no body to examine, no definitive death certificate from a recognized authority, only a consensus from trusted sources within the community and intelligence assessments. They were faced with the bureaucratic dilemma of closing a massive investigation without the finality of a conviction or even a certified death. Eventually, after their own verifications, they had to accept the reality. The manhunt was over. The Interpol Red Notice, which had dogged his travels for over a decade, was withdrawn. The legal cases that mentioned him continued, but now in the past tense. For the agents and police officers, there was a professional frustration. The ultimate prize had slipped away, but also a quiet acknowledgement that the pursuit itself had succeeded in its core objective. It had exiled him, dismantled his network, and hounded him to a desolate end. There would be no triumphant perp walk, no dramatic courtroom confrontation, but there was the cold satisfaction of knowing their relentless pressure had contributed directly to his isolated and miserable finale. In the wider world of organized crime, his death was noted with a moment of silent respect, a passing of an era among the older generation of European traffickers. Both within and outside the Armenian networks, he was remembered as a pioneer, a man who elevated the trade from a brutal street affair to a boardroom enterprise. For the younger generation, his death solidified the new landscape, one of fragmented factions and digital frontiers. He became a historical figure, a benchmark, a name invoked to signify a bygone age of Godfather who commanded with a word and settled disputes with a quiet judgment. The void he left was not filled by a single successor, but by a more chaotic, competitive environment. The news also triggered a quiet, global scramble related to his fortune. With the central brain of the financial network gone, the fate of his assets, the properties in France and Spain, the holdings in Armenian businesses, the funds and offshore accounts became a complex puzzle. Some assets were likely seized by French authorities under asset forfeiture laws, as they could now prove the origin of the funds more easily without his defense. Other holdings, embedded in the murky economies of Lebanon and Armenia, may have been absorbed by his former associates or family members, or simply vanished into the opaque financial systems of those countries. The process of untangling his wealth was as labyrinthine as the process of building it had been, a final testament to the complexity of his schemes. For his immediate family, whose lives had been defined by his shadow, his passing brought a harrowing mix of grief, relief, and continued uncertainty. The constant fear of his arrest or assassination was over, but they were now left with the burden of his name and the potential legal battles over his estate. Their mourning was necessarily private, conducted far from the public eye, a personal tragedy unfolding against the backdrop of his global infamy. They were the unintended, collateral victims of his choices, left to navigate a world that would forever associate them with a legend they did not create. Finally, for the chroniclers of this tale, the journalists, the author, the documentarians, his death provided a grim but necessary endpoint. It allowed the story to be told as a complete arc, from the streets of Beirut to the siege of Aleppo. It transformed an ongoing manhunt into a historical study. The quest to understand Serop Tashchian shifted from chasing a ghost to dissecting a legacy. Researchers could now interview former associates with less fear, examine closed court files, and piece together the full mosaic of his life. With the knowledge that the final piece was in place, his story became a case study in textbooks, a narrative woven in the understanding of late 20th century transnational crime. The confirmation of his death did not bring clarity so much as it allowed for a settled, if ambiguous, conclusion. It marked the point where the man became myth, where the ongoing investigation became history, and where the relentless pursuit of power met its absolute, quiet limit in a dusty room in a broken city, far from the marble courtrooms he once studied and the corporate boardrooms he once commanded. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadow life of Serop Tashchian, a journey that began with a disclaimer and a hook, and now concludes with reflection and a final call to witness. We have traversed continents and decades, from the hopeful classrooms of Beirut to the brutal trenches of the Lebanese civil war, from the corporate cunning of Marseille's underworld to the corruptible corridors of post-Soviet Yerevan, and finally to the dust and despair of a besieged Aleppo. This narrative, pieced together from the scattered fragments of police files, court transcripts, and diaspora whispers, was brought before you with a single purpose: to assemble a coherent account from the chaos of history, to trace the arc of a singular and cautionary life. The story of Serop the Lawyer is not merely a crime saga. It is a lens through which we can examine the hidden forces of our recent past, the power of diasporic identity, the criminal opportunities of globalization, the fragility of states, and the ultimate humbling supremacy of larger historical currents over even the most intricate of individual designs. We saw how a sharp legal mind, forged in the fire of communal trauma, sectarian war, could architect a criminal enterprise of breathtaking scope and sophistication, an empire built on the twin pillars of ethnic loyalty and financial ingenuity. We observed the patient, relentless response of the state, a response that relied not on dramatic shootout, but on the meticulous, boring work of financial audits, wiretap analysis, and international diplomacy, and we witnessed the unforeseen conclusion, where the chess game between the Godfather and the gendarmes was swept aside by the volcanic eruption of regional war, reducing the master strategist to a helpless refugee awaiting an anonymous death. This story holds up a dark mirror to our world. It shows us that the most dangerous threats to the social order are often not the loud, violent gangs, but the quiet, intelligent networks that mimic and infiltrate legitimate systems. It reminds us that the wounds of history, if left to fester, can manifest in destructive and unforeseen ways, and it underscores a sobering truth. The pursuit of power outside the bounds of law and morality, no matter how cleverly executed, is a pursuit of a phantom. That power is contingent, parasitic, and ultimately transient. It can be dismantled by the state's persistence or erased by history's storms. Tashchian's legacy is thus a paradox. He is remembered as a master criminal, yet his life's work was largely destroyed. He amassed vast wealth, yet died without access to it. He commanded fierce loyalty, yet died in isolation. He sought to build his own sovereign realm in the shadows, yet was ultimately defined by the very nation-states and historical traumas he sought to evade. His story serves as a powerful deterrent, not through the morality of his end, but through the demonstration of its sheer pointlessness. The empire, for all its complexity, left no positive mark. It only left scars on the addicted, on the corrupted, on his community, and on his own family. As this narration ends, we return to you, the listener, who has followed this tale to its quiet, desperate conclusion. If this journey into the hidden architecture of power and crime has held your attention, if it has provided a glimpse into a world normally closed to view, then consider this an invitation to delve deeper. The story of Serop Tashchian is but one thread in the vast and intricate tapestry of modern criminal history. There are other networks, other godfathers, other hidden wars being waged in the spaces between our legitimate world. Your engagement gives these stories a voice. Therefore, if you have found value in this detailed, researched account, please take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe to stay connected with future deep dives into the untold stories that shape our world. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what facets of this complex history intrigue you most. Your participation is what allows for the continuation of this work, the work of collecting, synthesizing, and presenting these narratives with care and context. Remember, the goal has always been and will always be to bring researched information to light, to look beyond the headline and the myths, and to understand the human and historical forces at play in the darkest corners of our recent past. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time and attention. This has been the story of the Armenian Godfather. May we all seek to build our legacies in the light.